So I did my presentation on the topic of preservation of paper-based archival collections at public library repositories. And it just goes over the various preservation options for these type of collections, as well as topics like handling, reference and access, and applying for grants. So what is so special about public library archival preservation? So there are 17,000 plus public libraries in the United States that serve more than 150 million patrons a year. And not all of these libraries have an archive, but most of them either have some sort of archive or archival materials in their collections. And something that is really important about public libraries is that they are accessible to anyone. So unlike a private archive or university archive, public library archives are very democratized institutions, and so the preservation of those materials is particularly important to carry on public access. And I included this image of patrons in an archival reading room at the Chicago Public Library over 100 years ago, just to emphasize the importance of public access to archives. And then this quote from Slow Fires really emphasizes the significance of preservation, because we are going to lose our shared cultural heritage resources if we don't do anything to save them. And then some of the most common formats and types of paper-based archival media that would be found in public library archives include bound volumes, manuscripts and papers collections, newsprint, including clippings files, scrapbooks, artwork and ephemera, maps and posters, and periodicals. And each type of archival media can be composed of dozens of different materials, and each of these materials needs unique preservation treatments and conditions. And so it's important to find a preservation environment that is going to be cohesive for a mixed materials paper-based archival collections, and also accounting for the history of paper when you're creating preservation standards for your institution, because you may have paper in your library that dates back hundreds of years, and it may be different materials from modern paper or 19th century paper. Some of the most common preservation issues that can happen to paper archival collections in public library archives include light damage, which can come from ultraviolet, natural, or infrared light, temperature and humidity damage caused by either high temperature and humidity or lots of fluctuations, pest damage, handling, and mechanical damage are particularly prevalent issues in public library archives because the materials are being accessed and used by patrons on a more frequent basis than would be seen in other types of archives. And then pollutants can also enter the archive through the outdoors or through chemicals in the building. And finally, disasters and theft have to be considered when you are dealing with preservation. And this image on the bottom just shows some newspapers from the public library archive where I work, and these newspapers were left out in the light and damaged by both light and pollutants, so they became very discolored and embrittled. So the first preservation option that you can take to help treat your paper-based archival collections in your public library archive is rebinding, or binding things that have never been bound before. And so there's a very helpful standard for library binding if a library is going to be doing its own binding on site. And this library binding standard will make your paper-based collections last for a much longer time than typical trade binding would. And so some of the considerations for binding and rebinding to make sure it's a cost-effective option for your institution would include how many items need to be bound, whether they have artifactual value, if you have on-site library binding equipment and staff that is trained to use that equipment, and how often the item is going to be used by patrons and researchers. And this image here from the binding standard just shows all the parts of a bound volume. So the second preservation option for paper-based collections is digitizing, and this is a particularly popular option right now. And so some of the benefits of digitization include freeing up space, increasing accessibility, reducing costs, and disaster preparedness. Some of the difficulties of digitization include cybersecurity concerns, having to train staff on various technical processes, potential lost files, and the inevitable obsolescence and degradation of the digital media. And so it's important to remember that if you choose digitization as a preservation option, it creates digital materials which must themselves be preserved. And some of the price considerations for choosing a digitization option include digitizing in-house, which is cheap but very time-consuming for staff. You can outsource mass digitization, but you have to be careful to avoid vendors who rely on prison labor or unethical practices. Sharing digital assets through a consortia agreement is another budget-friendly option. And then you also need to consider the cost of hosting your digital archival items on a web platform so that your patrons can access them. The third option for preservation is storage and rehousing of paper-based materials. So storage furniture should be baked enamel steel shelving, and wooden shelving should be avoided if possible. And then for enclosure materials, you should always use archival quality materials, which can be ordered from suppliers like Hollinger Metal Edge. And the cost consideration of the storage and rehousing is that storage furniture is very expensive, and so are archival quality enclosures. And so this is something that you should allocate money towards. And another consideration is applying preservation rehousing during processing by refoldering, which will save you time and money later on. The fourth option for preservation is deacidification. And so this will raise the pH of paper, and there are three options, which are aqueous, non-aqueous, and vapor phase deacidification. And you can do either a mass deacidification treatment or an individual treatment, and this can be a very costly process. I included a formula here for calculating the cost, but it is rather outdated because it's from the 1980s, but a formula like this could be used to decide if deacidification is going to be cost effective for your institution. Handling is another very important concern for public libraries because so many people, again, are going to be using the archival materials from a public library archive. And so it's important to train both staff and patrons on proper handling and to have the correct weights, bolsters, and gloves available for anybody who's going to be handling paper-based archival collections so they don't become damaged. And then reference and access are also really important parts of public library archival work, and there are a few considerations that need to be taken here, and that includes processing for access, so selecting the right approach for your repository, which could be MPLP, full processing, or even providing access to unprocessed materials. And then considering if any materials can be digitized to avoid physical handling and to prolong their lifespan, and then also setting clear expectation with patrons about handling and access and various preservation policies. And I included this quote from McCann on top, and in her article she really emphasizes that access and preservation are mutually dependent, and we don't need to view preservation as an obstacle to access or vice versa. And then when you're choosing preservation options for your public library archive, it's important to consider collection level versus item level preservation. So collection level can include establishing a correct preservation climate, which for paper-based collections is going to be 65 degrees Fahrenheit, and a relative humidity between 35 and 40%. And it's also going to include proper storage and possibly mass treatments like deacidification. And then if you want to preserve an individual item that's of particular value for your institution, options can include cleaning, repairs, rebinding, or conservation treatments, although this can be very expensive. So climate control represents the cheapest option for mass preservation, and conservation treatment is the most expensive option. And then finally, you may need to apply for funding because most public libraries are very underfunded, and this is an industry-wide issue, and typically there's not going to be a lot of funding allocated to public library archives, and so it's important to advocate for your repository and the materials in it, and to let people know that preservation has value to society. And some of the sources where you can apply for funding include the National Endowment for the Humanities, asking donors, if your institution has a board of trustees or Friends of the Library organization. And then there's also options to do collaborations with the NEDCC, historical societies, universities, and other cultural heritage institutions like museums. And advocacy is going to be the most important aspect of getting funding for your public library archive. And then some questions to consider include, what is the most cost-effective long-term preservation method that public libraries can use? And how can public libraries find an ideal balance between preservation and access? And should preservation goals and techniques be similar in all public library archives? And if it should be addressed on a case-by-case basis, what factors other than budget need to be considered? And then these are just the sources that I used when I was preparing this preservation presentation. So thank you all for viewing it, and please leave your comments on the questions.